We were speaking about there being massive voter turnout in the country, in the United States, but there is still concern as well over voter suppression. Texas, for example, has limited the number of ballot drop boxes to just one per county. In North Carolina, officials there are contesting thousands of mail-in ballots. And in some states, the strict requirement for voter ID is being blamed for disenfranchising millions of voters, many of them people of colour. So for more on this, I'm joined by Kristen Clark. She joins us live from Washington. She is the President and Executive Director of the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law. And of course, there have been thousands of legal experts volunteering to help voters navigate changes that they have to deal with and confusion over casting their ballot. Can you give us some idea of the demand that you've been seeing for this type of advice, that how many calls you're getting on your hotline and what voters are saying to you?
Sure, and thank you for having me. My organization runs a program called Election Protection, which is the nation's largest and longest running nonpartisan voter protection program. And for the past 2 decades, we've been working to ensure that eligible Americans, all of them, are able to freely cast their ballot. But 2020 is a different year. The pandemic has upended our elections, and we have found that voters encounter significant hurdles when it comes to accessing the ballot amid this deadly ongoing pandemic. There are states that have in place notary requirements for absentee ballots to count, witness requirements. There are many states that have failed to open up access to vote by mail and limited vote by mail to certain categories of people. Texas and Tennessee are 2 of those states. And then there are those who are bent on limiting access to drop boxes and are literally taking action at this moment that would make it harder for people to vote by, for example, eliminating curbside voting, which we just saw the Supreme Court put its stamp of approval on this week. What we have done through Election Protection is we have quadrupled the number of legal volunteers. We have 23,000 legal volunteers working 7 days a week on a hotline.
And can I just ask you, those volunteers, they've been getting floods of calls, and you mentioned Texas and Tennessee, places like Florida as well. Can you, what about how much demand, how many calls are you getting from battleground states?
Well, we're hearing from voters of color, in particular in states like Florida, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, Georgia, people who have faced long lines during early voting, people who have requested absentee ballots but haven't gotten them, and so they're not sure what to do. On average, we're getting about 7,000 calls a day, and that number continues to spike. And that's literally 7 days a week, because we know today, for example, there are a number of states that have opened up early voting in the country.
So just to be clear, you were saying that you have these election changes. Much of the confusion is driven by the pandemic. How pervasive are voter suppression tactics? Because in the last decade or so, I think half the states have adopted measures that require there to be certain ID requirements in order to vote, and restrictions to early voting.
That's right. Before the pandemic, we had been contending with significant levels of voter suppression. Localities that were shutting down polling sites in communities of color, communities that were purging eligible voters from the rolls, including Black voters, Latino voters, and other voters of color. States that were putting in place barriers to make it harder to get registered to vote. So when you pile the pandemic on top of that existing voter suppression, you have kind of a perfect storm. This has been a year like none other for the American voter in terms of the significant barriers and challenges that they face when it comes to exercising their voice in our democracy.
So can I just ask you to just focus, if you would, on one thing? You mentioned it when you were speaking there, but these barriers to voting, you were saying it affects communities of colour. Can you tell us more about the particular demographic that's affected by these measures?
Black voters are the #1 community often targeted by these tactics, and Georgia is Exhibit A when it comes to illustrating how voter suppression often plays out and rears its ugly head. Many of us have seen the long lines of Black voters in the Atlanta metropolitan area waiting to vote during early voting. We saw those same lines in Philadelphia, and that's because jurisdictions often are not making available sufficient numbers of early voting sites to meet the demand, to meet the size of the population in a particular area. And there was